Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on behalf of the ECFR and Polish-German Cooperation Foundation to our debate devoted to the relations between European Union and Russia. My name is Piotr Buras. I'm head of the Warsaw office of the ECFR. And our panelists, extinguished panelists, are Kadri Liik, Senior Policy Fellow at my institution, ECFR, great expert on Russia, author of numerous publications that you might find on our website. Hans-Peter Hinrichsen, head of unit for not only Russia but also the entire Eastern Europe at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany. You might know him as head of the political department at the German embassy in Warsaw. And last but not least, Marek Menkiszak, head of the Russian team at the Center of Eastern Studies. All those who are interested in relations between Russia and Europe will know him in Poland.
So maybe you can use your headphones if you don't mind.
Today our debate is named after divorce, so the question that might be raised when we have a look at the title of the debate is whether we do have a divorce, because we are not sure whether we had any kind of marriage here. I'm not sure if we can call the relations between Europe and Russia marriage. So I'm not sure if we deal with divorce right now, but I'm not going to get into deliberations on that topic. But the question is how to understand this divorce. Well, I think that we might understand it twofold. On the one hand side, in recent months or years, there was collapse of the impression that Russia might become a member of the West, a member of the community which shares some common values and is founded on joint foundations of not only interests but also values. And annexation of Crimea and aggression against Ukraine was the very moment when this illusion simply collapsed. But at the same time, the divorce might be understood in a different way, more fundamental one on the international arena, not only in Europe. We deal with a situation where the world based on codependencies, interdependencies. Well, in the past, we thought this would be the stable, solid, peaceful world. Well, it seems that this world is shattering, and we can see that in American-Chinese relations, when we talk about decoupling. And it seems that the relations between European Union and Russia should be perceived in a very similar way. When we have a look at EU-Russia relations, we might get the impression that for some time now there have been in a stage of stagnation. We've got European sanctions towards Russia and the impression that there is no constructive dialogue and there cannot be constructive dialogue. But it is not the case that under the surface nothing's going on. Well, various things are going on. We can see Russia's activities in Middle East, in Syria, in Moldova. We will talk about it later on for certain. Russia is still an important economic partner, or it is getting more and more important due to Nord Stream 2. We also have an approximation of Russia and China, which is also an effect of the changes that I've talked about. So we deal with new dynamics in the relations with Russia, in politics between Russia and the European Union. So the question is, against the backdrop of all those changes, the, so to speak, divorce and changes in the international arena, What about the relations between EU and Russia? Can they stay in the paradigm that was set a couple of years ago after the annexation of Crimea and the aggression against Ukraine? Or should we rather look for a new modus vivendi between the European Union and Russia? And there are two approaches arising in discussions on that topic. One of them is a return to business as usual, return to what we used to have. And we simply take all those conflicts that we face for granted. And there are certain approaches when it comes to sanctions. Should sanctions be abolished? Maybe they are too detrimental to the economy of the EU itself and its relations with Russia. But on the other hand, we've got an approach which also Kadri, in one of her recent papers, called business as not usual. So we should be looking for some new frameworks, conceptual frameworks, when it comes to relations between the EU and Russia. Framework that would not mean a return to the past, but maybe not a new opening, but we should set a path for the future. Steinmeier, in one of his recent speeches in Helsinki, said that Russia is looking for a new conceptual framework in relations with the EU and more sober relations which are not burdened with the expectation for Russia to change are emerging, and I can see a certain echo of what Kadri mentioned in her papers in the statement of Steinmeier. And that's why I would like to first give the floor to Kadri and ask her if we do need new conceptual framework when it comes to relations between the EU and Russia, and if yes, then where this need arise from, and what this conceptual framework would look like, taking into account the fact that we do not want to take the current situation for granted and simply forget about all the actions taken by Russia against the international order after 1989 and after the aggression against Ukraine.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Piotr, for bringing me here. Always nice to be in Warsaw. And Warsaw is exactly the sort of place where one should discuss questions related to Russia and European policy towards Russia. And indeed, it is my view that we cannot go back to business as usual. Not that we must not go back, but we cannot go back because that path is closed. It is impossible to go back. Russia has reconceptualized its own outlook towards Europe and towards the world, and I think Europe has moved on as well. What was business as usual? It was, Europe's relations with Russia were based on the assumption that Russia will become more or less a Western country itself, that Russia will transform, democratize, westernize, harmonize its ways with those of the West, and will become more or less one of us. Maybe not a member of European or Union or NATO, but a country that shares our values. And I think that is now evident that this is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. My thesis is that if Putin departs in 2024, that will not automatically happen either. Russia's current political stance is not a function of Putin, but it will outlast Putin. And that means that European Union and Russia should really abandon the former paradigm of relationship that expected Russia to change and converge, and to look for a new foundation for a relationship where we are not going to be sharing the values. Let's face it, it's not the case. And much as we would want Russia to democratize and become like us, it is up to Russia. And right now they are not simply there. So that is my thesis. We often, in countries like yours and mine, I come from Estonia, there is that permanent fear that the West will go back to business as usual with Russia. I think that is overblown. I don't think that is possible because Russia doesn't want it, and I think Europe doesn't want it either. If you look at thinking in different European capitals, and I have done so, we published EU-Russia power audit last year that looked into Russia-related thinking in all European capitals. Most of Europe sees Russia as a threat of first and foremost normative kind, because Russia is viewed as a country that wants to bring down liberal international order. And that analysis is shared pretty much across the board. The question is what to do with it. What should our new policy towards Russia be? And I think that is something that we should slowly start looking at. What should be the policy towards Russia that is not democratizing? Because all our cooperation formats, everything we have, apart from the 5 principles, everything other that we have is rooted in the former era when Russia was expected to become a Western country. And I think we should slowly start reviewing it. I don't think that we can come up with a new policy anytime soon, because everyone involved is a moving target. European Union is undergoing complicated internal processes. I think Russia's complicated processes will start shortly, because you can see how the regime is tired and bleeding life, basically. The world order is in flux. America is doing also funny things. And that means we cannot reach a stable concept for relationship, because given how normative power is the EU, I think eventually the EU-Russia relationship needs to be rooted in the wider world order. Russia will take European Union in one way if they think that we are one of the leading powers whose norms will be widespread in the world. But if they think that we are a waning power that will soon leave the stage, then their attitude is different. And I would say right now the jury is still out. Russia is betting on European Union influence declining. I take the liberty to disagree. But that dilemma will not be sorted out anytime soon. So things will take time. But nonetheless, I think we should start discussing what should Europe's Russia policy be. And my wish actually is to see much more of such discussion in countries like mine and yours, because these are the countries in Eastern Europe that feel threatened by Russia, that hence have invested a lot in knowing Russia. I mean, Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw is a prime example. There is a wealth of expertise, and I think it could be used a lot more to shape European policies in informed manner. I think right now we still are a little bit stuck in the former model of relationship. We keep pointing out what Russia does wrong or how Russia does not correspond to Western norms. And that's rooted in the concept of 1990s, in the expectation that Russia will converge. And hence you feel the need to point out that it doesn't. But that's old news. Everyone knows that Russia is not a democracy and not moving there. No one needs to be convinced about that. They knew it in Rome as well as in Warsaw. So we are fighting yesterday's battle. And that's what I urge people to do in Eastern European capitals, is to try to think a little bit more about what should the new policy be, and policy that could work for European Union as such. And I could finish with a quote from Estonian diplomat, our former perm rep in Brussels, who told me how his Italian colleague one day took him aside and said that, listen, Mati, now Europe's Russia policy is your Russia policy. That's what you have always wanted and advocated. But where does it lead us? And when? And how? And our guy didn't have a clear answer. And I think that answer is needed. The moralistic purist position in Warsaw and Tallinn, how should that resolve our Russia problem and when, given that Russia is not going to accept the rules we are trying to set to it?
Yes, thank you very much, Kadri. And you urged our countries from Central Eastern Europe or the Baltic states to come up with a new concept of EU-Russia relations, but it was actually, so far it has been just Germany, which has perhaps not come up yet with a new policy, but at least with a new term, a new European Ostpolitik, coined by Foreign Minister Maas almost 2 years ago. And could it be that is a new conceptual framework for EU-Russia relations be a part of this new approach advocated by Germany? And if yes, what could be could it consist of?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I wanted to draw the line a little bit bigger because you ended up with saying that we should stop our moralistic policy vis-à-vis Russia. I don't really see it as being moralistic. We have different concepts of international order. Russia is prone to go for a multipolar order, classical realpolitik, power play and so on. We are following a multilateral order. We are not doing it because we believe the one is more moral or something nicer than the other, but we have learned by experience that the multipolar order has created a lot of conflict, including in Europe. So we have a different concept. And I don't see that we can find a merger between those two, a kind of compromise between multilateral and multipolar order. With different concept, what power means and the role of the military and so on. So for the time being, I'm not quite convinced that we come to common terms with Russia, but we can only try to manage a situation in which we have very different ideas about how the international order should be organized. It's a kind of antagonistic relationship in which we have to prevent escalation from happening. We need dialogue channels, we need transparency mechanisms. In such an order, we certainly, and you write it in your article, need to bring our home in order. We have to get resilient, something that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, like, for example, hardening ourselves against cyber attacks, social media warfare, something like that, where we had no concepts because we didn't pay attention, we didn't expect that something like that could happen. And at the same time, what we see between Russia and the European Union and the states of the European Union is a process of mutual estrangement between the population. On our side, I would even say in Germany, it's not so much that people have something against Russians, but they lose interest. The young people don't learn Russian anymore. They don't go to Russia anymore because there are so many places all over the world that are more interesting to them than Russia. Russia, for them, is something of the past, and Putin is ridiculous in their eyes. So the problem is that we tend less and less to understand the situation east of the EU. And I think it's necessary that the European Union does have a Russia policy, which is more than the 5 Mogherini principles that you mentioned, basically for 2 reasons. One reason is that in the past we could count on the US as being the organizer, the ultima ratio in that region. If we didn't get things right, let's look at the Balkans, the US came and helped us out. I think this is over. And as Russia is not a Putin problem, this is not a Trump problem. Things have changed in the US. The US are looking to other regions in the world. They think Europe should resolve its own problems. So Europe is in charge of what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Moldova, or if we see things happening in Belarus. And we see it in day-to-day politics when our American colleagues ask us, what's the European position on that? and then they follow us on that. So we cannot rely on the US and the region anymore. We have to do it, and if we want to have influence, we have to do it as Europe, as united Europe. The second thing is, and we haven't mentioned that at all, traditionally we think that region as being between the EU and Russia, a bipolar situation. That's not the reality anymore. We have another player in the region, which is China. And I think none of the single European countries can stand up to China, not in the region, not elsewhere. So we need a strong European voice in the region. Europe must be united. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Now we come to Europäische Ostpolitik, European Eastern policy. What Minister Maas meant when he had in mind talking about a European Eastern policy is that we will only have weight east of the European Union if we stick together, if we are united. And that's really a challenge, because we do have different perceptions of Russia. We do have different historical experiences with Russia. We have different attitudes which are not rooted in day-to-day politics. The Polish attitude concerning Russia is not decided by one party and can change overnight, like, let's say, tax policy or something else, but it's kind of matter of national identity. And these identity questions are very difficult to deal with. And what we want to point out is that inside the European Union, we will have to talk much more about what the region is, what we think Russia wants, how to deal with it, to come together and find points of unity. I think it will be very difficult to develop a European Eastern policy as such, you know, a grand strategy, a set of things, 1, 2, 3 we have to do. But we can come up with a certain set of things that we have to do together. For example, increasing our resilience. To give a good example, we are learning a lot from the Baltic countries how to do it. Many cyber attacks that we experience in Germany, we get warnings from our partners in the East. Yeah. If it comes to Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, I think we have to stick together as Europeans and get organized and coordinated what we are doing there. We have seen it now with Moldova. We actually brought together a coalition of European countries saying, we're going for the new government. We all had in mind Venezuela, you know, you support one government and the old government doesn't go away. So that makes you cautious, but we decided we are going to support the Sandu government. And that helped tilt the balance in Moldova. That demonstrates if Europe sticks together and has a common voice, we have influence, especially in the region, and especially there's nobody else. The Americans, my opinion, do not intend to play a leading role in the region. That just leaves the Europeans, and the Europeans have to develop their own Eastern Europe policy.
Dziękuję bardzo. Marku.
Thank you. And now, Mark, your comment on what Kadri and Hans-Peter said. The question is still about, well, Hans-Peter talked a lot about Eastern policy of the European Union and the need for unity, but should the framework include, and can it include also a new concept of relations with Russia itself? What's your point of view? In Polish, yeah. Well, I have to say that I know Kadri and Hans-Peter. I've known them for a long time now, and I'm always impressed how smart they are. And I'm really impressed because the analysis they perform are really good and relevant. But I think that here in Poland, we need to emphasize other things as well, and let me do that. When we talk about problems in relations between EU and Russia, then these problems have not arisen yesterday or today. When we have a look at Kadri's paper, well, it stresses the year 2014 aggression against Ukraine as a breakthrough moment. And indeed, when it comes to the scope of the conflict, that event was unprecedented. But it seems to me that That's just another stage of a long-term process. The divorce did not take place in 2014. It took place in 2004 at the latest. At the end of 23 and at the beginning of 2004, where the decision was taken that the Russian country would be changed according to the rules which are not in line with European values, so that an authoritarian regime would be built to gain the status of a world superpower at the cost of, well, activities that were totally opposed to the European vision of what the situation should be in the continent. And since then, except for a short period of Medvedev's presidency, when we could hope that Russia would get back on the track towards pro-European modernization, but then Putin got back to power in 2012, and the decision was announced in autumn 2011. And that was the time where all the hopes that Russia could become one of us collapsed. All the hopes that Russia could become just like the rest of Europe. The aggression against Ukraine showed just the scope of conflict. It showed how deep the gap is, and it showed that the get back to the idea of one big Europe is fictitious and cannot happen. But I have the impression that despite all those dramatic events that took place, both when it comes to EU-Russian relations and international relations with Russia, we still deal with a way of thinking within the European Union, which results from the political culture and strategic culture in Europe, which is totally opposed to the culture in Russia. And that is the constant search for the answer to the question, what can Europe do so that Russia becomes a more friendly, a more responsible, reliable partner? So what can we, and let me stress the word we, do towards Russia? What can we think of? What can we offer to Russia so that Russia does not feel threatened, so that Russia rethinks its policies and changes its approach? And I think this is a mental trap. This leads to an impasse, to a deadlock. The problem of Europe is that it is unable to accept the fact that Russia is different. Because I think that this conclusion was reached a long time ago, a couple of years ago at the latest. But the problem of Europe is that it cannot accept a situation where we have constant conflict with Russia, and it's a natural, objective situation which cannot be avoided. We need to deal with this conflict, as we will have to live with it simply. And we should not look for a way to get rid of the conflict by adopting our policies. This is not the right approach. We should not do that. I think it's not realistic to claim that we are able to totally alienate Europe from Russia, because the interdependencies are too strong, and moreover, we should not do that because of the Russian society, or at least because of that part of the Russian society which is not in favor of its government policies. And most of all, Well, I agree that this is a long-term situation, but we should not help Putin's Russia to run policies that aim at strengthening this system. And in what way are we strengthening Putin's system? Well, we are providing it with legitimization in two ways. First of all, we intensify high-level contacts with Russia, irrespective of how Russia behaves. And the fact that Russia does not change its policies has no influence on us intensifying the dialogue with Russia. And the other thing are new deals, business that we do with Russia, new, important, and beneficial to Russia initiatives, new deals that support Russia as a country, but mainly they support individual people. So they support individuals who rule Russia and who think that Russia is their ownership. For instance, Gazprom, which is state-controlled, but also private companies such as Novatek. They are not politically neutral business structures. They are parts of the system which endangers the external world, but also its very own citizens. And by declaring that we want to strengthen cooperation, which really happens, we do something paradoxical. Right now, Putin's systems is very weak from the inside. And for the very first time in a long time, Kremlin is afraid of its own citizens. And there are lots of indications that Kremlin is afraid of its very own citizens. And there is a problem of legitimization of power due to a dramatic decrease in support for Putin and all the authorities in Russia. It seems that the Russian society is fed up with very aggressive external policies of Russia. And in that situation, instead of mounting pressure against Russia, we make steps which are interpreted by the Russian authorities and which are presented to the Russian society as a success of Putin's policy. So paradoxically, we are supporting this system. We help it survive. Well, I do not think that a dialogue with Russia is not needed. And I do not think that we should not be in dialogue with Russia. Dialogue is necessary all the time. We need to talk even to our enemies to be able to get to know their intentions, to check whether there are some changes when it comes to our enemies' rhetorics and approaches. But the question should always be, who is the other party within that dialogue and what do we want to achieve? Because it seems to me that we no longer understand what dialogue is. The next demand is to acknowledge that Russia is different than the rest of Europe and that it would not change in foreseeable future. And that we should not tell Russia what to do. Well, I agree that we should not tell the Russian people what they should do. We should rather give them good example, which is of course very difficult. But in my opinion, we should not abandon certain active, proactive approaches towards Russian society. And what I mean here is not active, it's not official relations. We should involve Russian civil society. It's very difficult to involve them, but this should be strived for, and I do not want to sound paternalistic. I do not want to impose any values on anyone. I do not want to be a hypocrite, but I think that we should sincerely present our problems and our solutions to the problems, and we should highlight the fact that our solutions to the various problems are very different from the Russians' approaches. We should also try to overcome the information barrier. I think that the projects of Russian-speaking media are really necessary. The media which are active in European countries and which are against the Russian regime, of course, this will be treated by Kremlin as a confrontative action, and rightly so. We should not support the system as it is a long threat to us. We should try to make it as weak as possible, and we should try to support those circles in Russia which are really growing in numbers and in power, that treat the current situation of the Russian government as a threat to their functioning. So this critical approach is something I very much encourage.
Interesting, important points, and I would perhaps first go to Hans-Peter and then to Kadri with a couple of questions. And Marek said that we should not be afraid of confrontation with Russia, and that we should stand a situation where we have a permanent, basically, conflict with this country. And so I would like to hear your reaction to what extent, you know, this is in line with the German thinking about, which is very much, I think, permeated by the idea of dialogue and rather interdependence, dialogue, and cooperation, and not confrontation and conflict. And secondly, Marek alluded to some gifts or presents made for the Russian leadership in the recent days or weeks, and I think probably maybe I'm wrong interpreting his words, but I think that's my opinion. One of them was the decision by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to accept Russia back, and. Is it the right? I know that Germany supported this move, even the Polish government supported this move, but is it really the right approach if we assume that there is no any longer a community of values between Europe and Russia? And that we, as Kadri suggested, we should perhaps have a different format of relations between European Union and Russia. Is it right to accept Russia's membership in the Council of Europe, which is clearly an institution which is based on certain values, which is based on certain rules, which are not shared by the Russian Federation. So perhaps this is the moment where we need to make a clear distinction and not shy away from confrontation or even conflict.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We are not shying away from confrontation with Russia. We have a principled approach concerning Russia. As I said, we are standing for certain international rules. You know, like inviolability of borders, like respect for the sovereignty of countries, and so on. These rules are essential to us because they are in our interest. This is the basis for the security in Europe. If these rules are violated by Russia, we stand up, like through sanctions. When we saw what was happening in Ukraine, we came up with a set of economic sanctions against Russia. When we see that Russia is militarily threatening its neighborhood, we position German forces in the Baltic countries. So we are acting. And in that respect, we are confronting Russia. But we are not looking for confrontation for the sake of confrontation. We think what we have to pay attention to as well is that this confrontation does not spin out of control. We regularly have interceptions over the Baltic Sea, nearby collisions of ships in the Baltic, may come up in the Black Sea as well. For that, and you alluded to that, we need functioning communication channels. Yeah, like the NATO-Russia Council, like bilateral channels. So we need to talk to the Russians at the same time. This is the dual-track approach that we are following, staying firm on our principles, but always being ready to negotiate. And some of the things in the world will certainly not be able to be resolved without some kind of Russian participation. If we look at Ukraine, if we look at Syria, we might say we're not going to talk to them, we don't want to legitimize that they are in Syria, but they are there. By ignoring it, we won't resolve a single question. Right? I wouldn't subscribe to the view that the Russian system is weak from the inside. I don't see much that points into that direction. I don't think that we legitimize the Russian government in the eyes of the Russian population by talking to them or whatever, cooperating with them on certain issues like environment or climate or something like that. As you said, I mean, if Russia is different and Russia wants to be different, we don't legitimize anything. We are not the yardstick. They are their own yardstick, like many countries are the yardstick for themselves. And I agree that Russia will not change for the foreseeable future. Russia has become a little bit more Russian again. Yeah? The extraordinary period was in the 1990s, early 2000s, but now we are kind of somewhat back to normal, not back to business. But in the self-perception of Russia, Russia is more Russian again, in the aspirations in the world, in the system, at home. Concerning the Council of Europe, we are of the opinion it's better to keep Russia in the Council, because then the people in Russia can still apply to the European Court on Human Rights. And it's not that Russia doesn't fulfill any verdict. They don't fulfill every verdict. But in many cases, they pay. And for the people in Russia, that is the last option that they have if they don't get their case in the Russian legal system. And we know that the Russian legal system does have its problems. So we think it's better for the Russians. And we keep them to the rules, because the European Convention on Human Rights still applies to Russia. And they would never claim that it doesn't. And if Russia steps out of the Council of Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights would not be valid for Russia anymore, and then Russia might even reintroduce the death penalty. I think if they took to the people and asked the people in Russia whether they would like to see the death penalty reintroduced, this might well happen. I think there is a majority in favor. So this is not feasible if Russia stays within the Council of Europe. But there are other arguments. We don't want to weaken the Council of Europe as an institution. If it becomes fashionable and feasible to step out of the Council and get rid of the obligations, others might follow suit. Azerbaijan might be at the brink of considering that, regularly criticized by the Council of Europe. Turkey, much bigger pill to swallow, might do the same. Yeah? These are rules the countries don't like. They stay within the system although they don't like it, because it's the norm for a European country to be in there. With the exception of Belarus, everybody's in there. And we don't want to weaken that rule. And that's the reason why we have said right from the beginning, it's better to have Russia inside the Council of Europe than out.
Kadri, I'm sure there are lots of points you would like to respond to, but I would like to add one more, and referring to Marek's point about the nature of Russia as a society or country which cannot be changed quickly, but still Marek argued that the European Union should try to support, for example, the civil society and a certain democratization processes, or at least resilience of civil society. Is this in line with your idea of a new conceptual framework, where basically one could perhaps understand it as a suggestion that we should give up on the idea of democratizing Russia and supporting, the internal developments in this country, which would be in line with our values, because we accept the fact that the country is different, and perhaps it's no longer needed or even helpful.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely in line with my vision. Now, when I say that we need new policy, I don't mean that this new policy should somehow reassure Russia that it's not threatened by us, or somehow overcome the conflict. I think that new policy is exactly needed for confrontation management or alienation management, depending on which it is, and it's probably going to fluctuate between one and the two for the other for the years to come. That's exactly the situation for which we need it. Overcoming it is not in our hands right now. We cannot achieve it, even if we want. So forget about that. But Russian civil society, yes, if we can think of ways to help them, and say many of those organizations are now foreign agents in Russia and cannot operate there. So when they come to our countries, walk up to our governments and ask for help, absolutely, we should grant it. But I wish we could get rid of the notion that we are democratizing Russia. I don't think that is happening. We can help Russia democratize if there are people who wish so and come here with those sorts of requests. But in general, the best thing we can do for Russian democracy is to make our democracy work, because that will revalidate democracy as a governance model for 21st century, because that's something that is now under question in Russia. And Putin's latest quote that liberalism has become obsolete, well, I think that's yet again taken out of context, and we are debating it without clarifying the terms, and basically it's a huge mess. But in a way, it shows that he thinks that our model is not viable. So we need to prove the opposite, and that will help Russia a great deal, believe me. They are following us, they are looking at what's happening, and they are drawing conclusions all the time. And they notice. And many people in Russia, including some really hardline foreign policy analysts, have told me that, of course, you need to sort out your problems, because otherwise we have no chance of sorting out our problems. So it starts at home. We need to become an example again, because Western example was that launched the whole thing in Eastern Bloc, perestroika, collapse of Warsaw Pact, and so forth. It was example. It was not so much pressure politics. And it's example that is now become shaky, and that we need to restore. As concerns legitimizing Putin with high-level contacts, well, these can only be viewed as legitimizing if we have said that having no contacts is punishment. Why did we ever say so? I don't know. Because, contacts we are having with Putin are not necessarily nice. Angela Merkel has had tens of phone calls with him. I don't think Putin likes the contact of these. And I think he's reminded of some very harsh truths. I think that's a positive channel, and it always has been. Or take Putin's meeting with Theresa May. I don't think that legitimizes Putin in any way. I mean, my thinking is exactly the opposite. Why would Putin meet with an outgoing prime minister of a country whose politics is total mess? The only reason I can think of is that he understands that he is guilty of something and wants to do something about it in his own peculiar way that doesn't involve directly admitting guilt. So I don't think that is May reaching out to Putin at all, but it's pretty much vice versa, actually. And as concerns internal unrest and foreign policy, I I think these things are linked, but in an adverse way. Internal climate in Russia changed after Trump was elected. Before that, Russia was readying itself for harsh geopolitical standoff, and people were rallying to the flag. The moment Trump was elected in America, the notion of a harsh standoff just vanished because no one could take Trump seriously as a harsh adversary. And that's when people started speaking out in favor of improving relations with the West by Russia doing something for the sake of improvement, not just West correcting mistakes. And that's when civil society started protesting. So I would argue that the link is reverse. The sort of more relaxed international atmosphere helps unrest in Russia, which is not to say that we should relax it further just for the sake of internal situation with Russia. I think we are not nearly good enough to manage internal situation in Russia. So we should just do our thing and let them do their thing. I think that is really the best.
Marek, would you like to respond to anything you have heard as also a reaction to your comments?
No, tak naprawdę to
Well, in reality, if we consider what we are talking about now, it is quite difficult to say that we do not agree in many areas. Well, there might be some single points where we do not agree. However, it is all about the details. It is about how we define certain notions, how we understand them. What does business as usual mean, for example, between Russia and the European Union? If business as usual means a situation in which, on the one hand, we have Russia being aggressive, and on the other hand, there are normal business relations between Russia and the European Union, and there is a normal political dialogue. Well, this is not what we have and should, because there are sanctions still in place and there are still some limitations with regard to the political dialogue. For example, there are no summits between Russia and the European Union, but it's even difficult to imagine what such summits between Russia and the European Union should be about. But it is a problem, I think, that the situation we are dealing with now, which is going in this direction. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean those ideas, those discussions as to how the sanctions are not effective, as to the problem whether the sanctions should be limited, should be made weaker, or should not be related to the Minsk agreement, or that maybe Russia should have access again to loans from the European Bank of Development. All these steps, I think, are going towards a situation which is defined by Kremlin as acceptable, because Russia still occupies a significant territory of a big European country, and there is a war going on. There is a war between Russia and Ukraine. People are dying every week. There are some people dying, several people dying in Donbass. And at the same time, we have the situation that even though there are sanctions, there are also new agreements being made between Russia and the European countries, and the political dialogue is developing all the time. This is something acceptable, totally acceptable for Russia. So we could say that this is not business as usual, that is business better than usual. Because Europe has given up criticizing Russia in a harsh way, also as regards its internal situation. And Europe has also given up the idea of democratizing Russia, which is, of course, something that Kremlin likes a lot. And on the other hand, Europe is developing its relations with Russia as it is. So this situation, the status quo, is fully acceptable for Kremlin. And please remember that Kremlin has a certain vision of Europe, and Kremlin believes that Europe is changing towards a direction that is perfect for Russia. Please remember that in Italy, the Liga is the the strongest political force, and we of course know that this party is pro-Russian. We also realize that in France, the National Front which is also quite pro-Russian, is becoming the leading political force. And the third or the second political party in Germany is becoming AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is also quite pro-Russian. So from the perspective of Russia, a new Europe is being born, is coming to life. And that's why Kremlin, and I agree with Kadri, Kremlin has no interest in business as usual, because Kremlin believes that it can be even better than business as usual. Kremlin believes that its relations with Europe can be even better for Russia. Relations with Europe, which is changing and becoming more and more fragile and exposed to different threats coming from Russia, like cyber attacks or corruption, which is, of course, making Putin's regime stronger and stronger, both internally and internationally. So I think it is really not about alienating Russia. It wouldn't be good, it wouldn't be realistic to alienate Russia, to isolate Europe from Russia completely. However, we should pose ourselves this question: what kind of Russia would be in our interest, and what kind of politics, what kind of policies in Russia would be in our interest, and are the current policies in Russia in our interest? I don't think so. And that's why we should adopt policies that will try to change Russian policies. And if Russian policies should change, well, this is only possible if the whole political system in Russia changes. So whatever helps support all those people and institutions and initiatives in Russia that are working to dismantle this political system in Russia should be supported. And this is not about morality. Please don't get me wrong. This is just realpolitik for me.
Thank you, Marek. Kadri wanted to react, and Hans-Peter too. Yeah?
Yes, I think that wanting Russia to change is good, but what is the best policy for it? I mean, we could have adopted a policy that could have had a chance of bringing down the regime. Had the West gone after SWIFT in 2014, then actually Russia would have been in great trouble. But we didn't do that, and I think rightly so, because that would have been viewed as existential threat by those in the Kremlin, and they would have retaliated in ways that we would not have been prepared for. So my view here is that you just need to let it fizzle out, the Putinist bubble in Russia. You need to give it time to self-destruct. If we go into sort of head-to-head collusion with it, then the outcome is worse than otherwise. And I think sanctions, I don't think sanctions are going to be lifted. There are countries in the EU that are totally against it. There are France and Germany, who are countries in Normandy format. They report back to the rest of the EU about progress. If there is not enough progress, they cannot recommend lifting of sanctions. And I don't think they will. We could have some disagreement if Russia started moving in the positive direction in Donbass. In that case, yes, some countries would suggest gradual lifting of sanctions, and others would say that we only lift sanctions once Ukraine has regained control of its border. That's the disagreement I could see far in the horizon if Russia starts some positive movements, but that's not the case now. So that debate is not happening now. And I don't really believe in uncontrolled collapse of sanctions either, not least because it doesn't benefit any businesses. I mean, what are Russians hoping? Marek, you said that Russians are hoping that European far right will help them. I don't think so. They actually understand that these people's capacity is limited, both political capacity as well as intellectual. So their breakthrough into prominence would need to be a lot bigger than it is in order to make difference on Russia front. But what they are hoping, really, they are hoping that business interests will take over and achieve lessening of sanctions. But I don't think so that lifting of sanctions, unless Russia has fulfilled conditions, is in the cards, and I don't think that would benefit the businesses either. I mean, I had a conversation about that with a German banker working in Moscow, and he basically pleaded that whatever you do, don't allow sanctions to collapse in an uncontrolled manner, because that would lead to each European country having its own sanctions regime vis-à-vis Russia. Some would upgrade and join the American level of sanctions. Others would downgrade, and it would be a total cacophony of rules. And multinational businesses working in Moscow would need to be compliant with everything, and it's a horror dream for them. American sanctions policy is already hard enough. So I really don't think that business lobby is even behind it. I mean, it's traditional to assume it is, but I think it is not. I mean, business would be in favor of orderly lifting of sanctions by disagreement and conditionality, not collapse of them, because their life would be made a lot harder by that.
Thank you, Kadri. Before I give you a chance to ask questions, Hans-Peter, last comment from the panel.
To allude on the issue of business as usual. I think the Russians have a concept what they think business as usual means. That is lifting of sanctions, especially the European sanctions, but of course the American sanctions. So it wouldn't make much difference if we lifted the European sanctions without any change on the American sanctions. They would like to see military-to-military cooperation restored. This is at least what they tell us, you know, what we had in previous times, which is not in the cards right now. They would love to join G7 again to become G8, you know. They would love, at least they ask us, to have government-to-government consultations. So to sum it up, what they would like to do is to be treated like everybody else, with whom we don't have problems. And this is not in the cards. I completely agree with Kadri. I don't see this road to business as usual. And I don't see this road as being Russia on the winning side. If I look, you describe it in your article at Ukraine, for example. This is not a success story for Russia. They got it, they don't know how to do with it, what to do with it, how to get out. Look at the US. Trump was a big hope, but he cannot deliver due to what happened in 2016, big mess. Syria, they got in, but they don't get out. They have the Iran problem. They actually don't know what to do. So not everything is looking wonderfully for Russia, and not everything is falling into places, and not everything is developing in the direction of business as usual. And so I'm very much with Kadri saying we have to look at each and everything on its own merits, see how things develop, and then react. But not assume that more pressure, more confrontation will automatically benefit us. We have to think things through from the end. What will be the outcome? You know, what do we achieve with it? And so we have to see it very, very differentiated.
Dziękuję bardzo. Zapraszam Państwa do pytań.
Very much. I would like to open a Q&A session.
Jan Jakub Romitz, I'm a researcher at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. I have a question for all three panelists. We are now getting into the new institutional cycle in EU institutions. What would be your recommendations regarding the tools of European foreign policy for the new leadership? Which tools should be strengthened, maybe scrapped, maybe continued?
Following question, are we able to work out a joint policy towards Russia that would encompass both Western countries, which have their own perspective, and Central European countries, which are neighboring Russia or Belarus? The latest events in the European Parliament or in the Council of Europe showed the difference, because on the one hand Russia was reinstated, but on the other hand there was a very negative comment from Ukraine, which compared Strasbourg to Munich, and also the reaction of Baltic states, Poland and Georgia was also very negative. So it seems difficult to work out a joint statement that would be accepted by all European Union states as one joint position towards Russia. Wacław ważne. Well, the internal politics need to be reasonable, and how does it influence external policies? Because if we have a country with a very global position, such as Germany, US or EU, well, they are dependent on export, import, raw materials, but the situation is different with small Central European states. So, well, the very concept of dialogue might be understood in a different way for small countries and for big countries, because the perspective is totally different. So it seems to me that it's impossible to have a joint policy towards Russia, because it is totally normal that Russia treats various countries in a different way. And in my opinion, globalization is of importance here. There are potential alliances, but in the face of potential conflicts in the Middle East, Iran, and so on and so forth, players in big countries behave in a different way than smaller countries. So in Poland, it seems totally unlikely that we would have positive long-term positions with Russia. So the perspective of Central European states is different than the perspective of Western states. It all depends on how big players we are, and the situation is really different. And this has always been the case. Well, we are very thankful for the comment. Well, okay. I would like to put an end to the question right now. We do not have more time. Okay, so geopolitics is of importance here, and the relation between external and internal politics. I think the most problematic thing is to understand what Russia wants to achieve. We might have certain ideas. Well, we want to treat policies in a reasonable way. We want to have economic interest. And it's impossible to understand Russian policies from that perspective when we have a look at Russia's policies in Donbass, in Syria, and so on and so forth. So, am I right here? Well, I think that in Russian politics, it's all about prestige. They want to be a superpower, and it's really difficult for Russia to be one of the superpowers of the world. That's why they are entering certain surprising coalitions and alliances, for instance, with China.
Three first questions, they all boil down to the question about the future of the EU foreign policy towards Russia. Is a EU foreign policy, a coherent EU approach to Russia possible? That was the third question asked here about the domestic policy context of all main stakeholders of the EU foreign policy. To what extent they are dominant factors shaping EU's or those countries' approach. Then the question about is it possible to have a common approach to Russia if we have such divergent views on this country between the West European countries and the Baltic states? or Central Eastern European countries on the other. And the question about the EU foreign policy tools, what kind of, I think we could narrow down this question to the question about Russia. What kind of tools we have at our disposal to shape our approach to Russia and to make it more efficient. And last but not least, perhaps mostly a question for the typical question for Kadri. What is the drive? But of course, all of you are very competent to answer it. What is the driver of the Russia's foreign policy and its actions on the global stage? So maybe we'll start with Marek.
Postaram się krótko.
I'll try to be short. What kind of instruments, what kind of tools are at our disposal within the European policy? I agree with the following. If we want to have an active policy towards Russia and to limit the capacity of Russia and to make it impossible for Russia to hurt us, we should just focus on ourselves and strengthen the tools of fighting money laundering. We should strengthen the control of bank transfers. We should control the energy agreements, and we should make sure that the rules are compliant with, that the rules of the European law are compliant with. And we should not tolerate double standards. Like you have the elite, the Russian elite, that is very aggressive towards the European Union. However, members of this elite live in Europe. They send kids to European universities. They shop in European shopping centers, and some of them, even though there are personal sanctions applying to them, they are granted individual permits to visit certain member states of the European Union, even though there are sanctions that apply to them personally. So this should be stopped, and this should be some real help to weaken the Russian political system in a very significant way. Now, the question about a common policy towards Russia, of course, this is very difficult, and I think right now it would be a very difficult compromise to accept the 5 points suggested by Mogherini. Well, what are these 5 points about? This is about a dialogue policy, but this is also about being resilient and about deterrence. Dialogue, deterrence, and resilience. These are the pillars of that policy, and I think in the foreseeable future it is difficult to imagine a significant change of that policy. And now the Council of Europe, I realized that it was a very difficult decision to take, and I also realized that what I'm saying may be not in line with what I was talking about earlier and what related to supporting this civil society in Russia. But let's face the reality. Russia did nothing, absolutely nothing, to justify restoring its voting rights, because the suspension of the voting rights was a political sanction after the annexation of Crimea. Right now, the Russian government is very outspoken about seeing this situation as a political success, both internally and externally. And the Russian government are now saying that the situation in Europe is changing. Putin is saying that Europe does not want to be Russia-phobic anymore. Putin is saying that Europe has already come to terms with the fact that Crimea has become Russian. This is what you hear on Russian TV. This is part of Russian propaganda on Russian TV. And this is a very difficult precedent that shows that Russia is able to blackmail Europe even if the actual threat is to hurt its own citizens, because that was the alternative. What was Russia saying? Russia was saying, if our voting rights are not restored in full, if you keep discussing the possibility of suspending the involvement of Russia in the European Council, then Russia will leave the European Council itself, which will mean that the Russian citizens will no longer be able to bring cases to the European Court of Human Rights, which is indeed seen as the highest instance of the judiciary in Russia, because many Russian people believe that they cannot really rely on the Russian courts, and they see the European Court of Human Rights as the last resort. And sometimes Russia respects the rulings delivered by the European Court of Human Rights, and sometimes it does not. So you can see that the European government thinks that this tactical approach has been successful. So we just need to wait, and then things will improve. We just need to be patient. And if they see that this tactical approach is successful, they will apply it again and again, and maybe we'll witness more Russian activities that will put Europe in a difficult position, dealing with a dilemma. Do we want to protect our values also with regard to Russian citizens, or maybe not? Maybe we want to have this approach based on principles, even if we need to accept the consequences this will entail. And I think this is a very dangerous phenomenon. I will not refer to other aspects or arguments, because they were rather comments and not questions. As regards the cooperation between Russia and China, I think this is a very difficult element. I do not go into details. However, we can see in the European narrative, and this is very interesting, I think, now in the European narrative we have this geopolitical argument. Geopolitics was like a forbidden notion. We didn't want to focus on that in the European narrative, and now this is like coming back in certain discussions and even decisions, for example, the decision regarding Nord Stream 2. Like we were saying, we cannot give up the economic cooperation with Russia, or the energy cooperation with Russia, because otherwise Russia will start strengthening its cooperation with China, which will be harmful for all of us. So there is yet one more argument for strengthening the cooperation with Russia, namely we do not want Russia to strengthen its cooperation with China. And this is indeed very interesting. It's not just about morality anymore. It's not just about purely economic business interests. We also have this geopolitical argument in favor of strengthening our cooperation with Russia.
Thanks very much. I could say a lot about that, but I'm holding back for the moment. Concerning the tools of foreign policy, I come to that after my initial remarks at the end, perhaps. Tools of foreign policy, I think from a German point of view, anything that makes the EU more effective is good. We have the common security defense policy, we have PESCO, we often lack the unity to find the right decisions, so we have spoken out, for example, in favor of qualified majority voting. That not just one or two member states can block decisions by the EU, because the EU is very much emasculated. It's not really a capable actor on the international scene. So I think if we want to have a common policy, we need tools that enable us to come to a conclusion, even if there is not 100% unity. And that's already in the Treaty of Lisbon, so we just have to implement that in many instances. Look at sanctions, for example. Who we could list, we could decide by majority, if we wanted to, if we have the political will to do that. The question is it feasible to have a common foreign policy on the East? you said it's very difficult, and I agree. The first thing we have to do is we have to take seriously where the others are coming from. If we see Poland, the Baltic countries, the Swedes, and so on, we have to see and accept that they do have a different historical experience, a different perspective, a different geographical location, and we have to take that seriously inside the European Union. These are our EU partners and our NATO partners. And we are going to talk with them first if we are going to define a Russia policy. That's very important. But at the same time, we have to be ready and willing to do compromises. Give you an example. For the Western countries and the Southern countries, Russia is not very imminent. Far away, they only look at it as a potential market. If you want their solidarity in the East, they want your solidarity in the South, which means finding a solution on migration. I think you cannot say, please help us in the East, but your problems in the South don't interest us. This is not the way the European Union works. If we are willing to strike these compromises, I think we can find a common policy. But my impression is that over the years, we have walked away from the idea of compromise. And that makes it very difficult. So we have a lot to do, but I'm not totally pessimistic that we cannot find common solutions. I found one question very interesting about the small countries. How can we talk with Russia if Russia doesn't take us seriously? And that's not just Central European. The Norwegians say the same, for example. Yeah? The Russians don't really take us seriously. We are too small. This is why we have the international institutions. You're a member of NATO. You're a member of the European Union. You're inside the OSCE. You're in the Council of Europe. And when you talk there to the Russians, it's one-on-one. In the European Union, it doesn't matter whether you're small or big. It's one voice that counts. I admit that the Russians don't always understand that, but that's the way it is. So use the institutions. If you want to talk to the Russians and you find they don't pay attention to you, go to Europe and say, we need to talk to the Russians as EU. And that makes your position very, very different. I heard that it is difficult to understand the Russian positions. I'm not so sure, because I heard that the Russians want to be on par with the two other big superpowers they see, the US and China. And if you accept that, it's very easy to predict what they're going to do. I think it's easier to predict them than the US. For us, the US sometimes are more difficult, especially under President Trump, to read and predict what they are going to do. Yeah, that's the way you have to deal with international politics. Council of Europe. I don't agree to the notion that Russia got everything they wanted. What they wanted actually was guarantee not to be sanctioned again, anytime, anymore. And they didn't get that. And still they return. And the Council of Europe will work out a sanctions mechanism in which the Council of Ministers and the Parliamentary Assembly will come together and decide which sanctions to take. Because what the Parliamentary Assembly did in 2014 without legal basis, they did it on their own. We are going to have a legal mechanism, and that can still be used against Russia if there are serious violations of rights that are guaranteed by the Council of Europe and its mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you, Hans-Peter. Maybe a few points on the geopolitics as well, because this will be your last intervention, I'm afraid, because we are running out of time. If you want.
I wouldn't subscribe to the view that we are now back to geopolitics, because what we are doing with our eastern neighbors is still based on our values. And it's not simply about geopolitics backing those countries to withstand Russia, but it's about transforming these countries, that they are able to have their own sovereignty in practice, which means, in the case of Ukraine, for example, that the future of Ukraine is not decided in Donbass, but it's decided in Kiev. Whether the Ukrainian government is successful in eradicating corruption, having a rule of law, having correct government, all these things, they are more decisive than a confrontational stance vis-a-vis Russia in the east of the country. Because if this doesn't turn out to be a success story, if we don't see the reforms according to the European models, I don't think that Ukraine will have the power to resist, to withstand in the long run, because it will always be open to Russian influence, be it through oligarchs, be it through corruption, be it through the judiciary. So this is not that we can give a geopolitical discount to a country and say, as long as Moldova is anti-Russian, they can do what they want. We could have been fine with Mr. Plachotniuk. We are not. And we told him that. And that was one reason why he left. Yeah? He claimed to be pro-European, but he didn't do anything concerning reforms that are pro-European. And we will assess governments not by what they are telling us. This is what we had to learn. But we will closely look what they are doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Kadri, you have the final word in this.
Thank you. I'll try to address 4 questions. What does Russia want? Well, that's an easy one. Actually, Hans-Peter, I think, described it earlier quite correctly. Russia does want a multipolar world. It's a normative challenge, and it's about world order. They want a world that is organized around a number of superpowers. Number can vary, but these superpowers are the ones who sort out world affairs, and smaller ones belong into their spheres of responsibility and need to be under control. I think that's Putin's world model, and that's what he is working on, not via any sort of grand strategy, but using opportunity to intervene when he sees it, such as Syria. And we just need to see it for what it is. Where is disagreement? What could be our tools? I think we should have better policies where we can. You know, Syria is a good example here. I remember Sergei Lavrov saying that European policy on Syria all too often consists of saying what Russia needs to do. And he was right. We didn't have much more than rhetorics and saying, you know, what Russia is doing wrong and what it should do. That doesn't fly with Russia. They don't listen to it. But if we had had our own policy that was working on the ground, that Russia would have had to take seriously, the way we had to take Russian intervention seriously. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have intervened in Syria. Those things were discussed and we found ourselves not to be ready. So maybe our leverage in the Syrian case is indeed limited on some conditionality as concerns getting involved in reconstruction. That might be all there is. But on other cases, instead of moralizing, we should have policies. And that is something that Russia would take much more seriously. Can Europe have joint positions? I would say that it's definitely hard, but a lot easier than sometimes earlier. Because right now, I think European understanding of Russia is much more united than it was, say, 10 years ago. Because then we really had analytically different pictures. Some countries thought that Russia was democratizing, others saw that authoritarian regime was consolidating. We had different experiences with Russia. I mean, really, the Baltic states had become victims of Russian hybrid warfare already. Baltics experienced that in 2005 when Kremlin set up that Modest Kolarov workshop that intervened in CIS countries and the Baltics. So we really experienced it earlier, and the rest of Europe simply caught up with us. So I think that now the European experience with Russia is much more harmonized. And I guess that it should be possible to agree, because Southern Europeans, they understand that for Northerners and Easterners, Russia question is existential. So, you know, as long as they want anything at all from the EU in terms of support, they cannot deny us our existential interest. That's not how it works. But Hans-Peter is of course right, that we should have in mind their existential interest as well. And I think we should discuss Russia more in greater detail, concrete detail. How do they understand it? How do we understand? What has worked? You know, my naive probably idea is that we should make that variety of European experiences a wealth, not an obstacle. We have looked Russia from so many different angles. That's a wealth of experience. Why don't we manage to use it as such? And when it comes to small countries' influence, I think there is a way to do it. Just work harder. Be intellectually ahead of curve. There is shortage of ideas on international level. And if anyone can propose any smart and workable ideas, it doesn't really matter where he or she comes from. It can be the tiniest country on earth. If the idea is good, that will get maybe stolen, maybe adopted, but it will get somewhere. And my good example here always is Swedish government, Carl Bildt's government from 91 to 94. They made the Russian troop withdrawal from the Baltics their policy priority. How did they go about it? They sent their best diplomats to the Baltic states, to Russia, to all the related countries. They made themselves the most knowledgeable country on those issues. And by being that, they managed to influence the position of the United States as well as European Union. And let me remind, they were not even members. They were only negotiating membership, and they became members in 95. They were really punching above their weight by working, by getting to know the players' landscape issues better than others. And that's what small countries like ours should do. We often declare that Eastern neighborhood is our priority, but do we behave like that? Do we send our best and brightest there? Do we really work on it? Or is it just sort of declarations? And it's sometimes one, sometimes the other, but I think it's clear what needs to be done.
Dziękuję bardzo. Chciałem bardzo podziękować naszym...
Thank you very much. I'd like to extend thanks to our panelists. Thank you so much for supporting me. I think it was a very important and vital debate, full of important topics, some disagreements, which is a good thing. And I think that all the panelists agreed that business, not as usual, is necessary in relations of EU and Russia, although we might not agree yet as to what it should look like exactly. And I would like to ask Kadri for her call at the very end concerning the need to influence EU policies also through smaller member states. She said we should be active, we should be innovative, we should work out certain demands which will be then discussed and sometimes even stolen. And thank you so much for the debate. I think the discussion will be continued, and thank you so much for your attention, for joining us here. Have a nice summer. That's the last ECFR event before the summer break.